So, India says it's ready. If you listen to the official statements coming from the government and the Fertilizer Association, the message is super uniform, calming, and confident. They're telling us they have absolutely sufficient fertilizer inventories from the impending Kharif season. That's India's crucial autumn monsoon crop season. The official line is literally just supplies are steady and there's nothing to worry about. As a global food security analyst evaluating potential systemic risks, I always start by looking at these official baselines. I mean, obviously, they want the markets and the farmers to stay perfectly calm. But we kind of need to shatter that illusion right out of the gate. When you cross-reference those official calming assurances with the actual real-time supply chain data, a totally different, frankly terrifying reality emerges. Right now, 3 major domestic urea plants have quietly cut their production. And on top of that, crucial imports from the Gulf have entirely stopped. So suddenly, those confident government assurances are on a direct collision course with a massive supply shock. Literally 1.4 billion people are about to test whether the reality on the ground actually matches the rhetoric on paper. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're putting on our analyst hats and conducting a full systemic risk assessment of India's massive fertilizer stockpile gamble. We're going to look at how a localized energy bottleneck, specifically those geopolitical disruptions happening in the Gulf, is rapidly cascading into a slow-motion threat to global food security. Because let's be real, when a country with 1.4 billion people hits a brick wall with its agricultural supply, it doesn't just stay a local problem. It instantly becomes the entire world's problem. To really understand how this crisis is unfolding, we're going to mechanically dismantle the situation step by step. So we'll cover 1, the supply chain vulnerability, 2, the 3-plant shutdown, 3, the ticking stockpile clock, 4, the subsidy budget bomb, and finally 5, the global food contagion. Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the supply chain vulnerability. To really grasp this first domino, you have to understand India's absolute massive scale. India is the world's second largest fertilizer consumer, right behind China. Their agricultural sector requires a staggering 55 to 60 million tons of fertilizer every single year. And within that massive demand, urea is the biggest piece of the puzzle, accounting for about 35 million tons. Now, to pull this off, India relies on a finely calibrated, just-in-time supply chain. Domestic production is strong. It actually covers about 80% of their total urea demand. But that leaves a crucial, non-negotiable 20% that absolutely has to be fulfilled by a continuous, uninterrupted flow of imports. And here's the major vulnerability. Over 40% of all India's urea and phosphate imports come straight from the Gulf. Saudi Arabia alone handles over 15%, with Qatar, Oman, and the UAE filling in the rest. It's an incredibly fragile setup. Think about it. The food security of 1.4 billion people is basically floating through the volatile Strait of Hormuz. This whole just-in-time model assumed continuous safe passage. It absolutely did not account for a prolonged geopolitical blockade that freezes the exact imports India relies on to top up its buffer. Which brings us to Section 2, the 3-plant shutdown. This is the real-time indicator proving that this finely tuned model is breaking down right in front of us. On March 9th, we actually got the smoking gun. The Indian government made a quiet but incredibly consequential decision. They cut natural gas allocations by a massive 30% to 3 major domestic urea plants. And we're not talking about small facilities here. This included IFFCO, which is the country's absolute largest fertilizer cooperative. Why? Because the Gulf LNG supplies, which act as the essential feedstock for these plants, had just dried up. This threw an impossible, stark choice right into the government's lap. With only a finite amount of natural gas available, they literally had to choose. Do we allocate energy to keep the electricity running in our major cities? Or do we provide feedstock to produce fertilizer for the farms right before the vital pre-Kharif procurement season? Well, they chose the cities. But in doing so, they actively drove down their own domestic urea output at the exact moment seasonal demand is ramping up. So the import gap is widening, and the imports simply aren't arriving to fill it. So let's look at Section 3, the ticking stockpile clock. Now we're facing the terrifying math of an impending deadline. Just how much does India actually have in storage to weather this? While exact, up-to-the-minute numbers are closely guarded, historical data tells us India typically enters the Kharif season with a buffer stock of about 4 to 6 million tons of urea. But here is the massive problem. The Kharif demand runs between 15 and 18 million tons. Since domestic production is dropping by 10 to 15% because of those gas cuts we just talked about, India is suddenly staring down a looming, severe deficit of 2 to 4 million tons. And that deficit, it has to be pulled directly from that finite 4 to 6 million ton buffer.
When you actually plot this on a timeline, it reveals a highly compressed runway. Let's look at it. We start at March 9th, when the gas cuts began, and Q1 Gulf imports ground to a near halt. As we hit late May and June, the monsoon starts, and aggressive planting demand really kicks into high gear. If the disruptions in the Gulf extend past June, India will be burning through its final reserves right during peak season. So by August or September, this timeline shows the buffer being entirely 100% exhausted. They're basically racing against a clock that's ticking down fast.
All right, moving to Section 4, the subsidy budget bomb. See, a physical supply shortage doesn't just mean empty warehouses. It instantly morphs into a catastrophic macroeconomic problem for the state. Let's look at the financial fallout here. India manages its fertilizer costs through this massive government subsidy, basically shielding farmers from global market volatility. Before the crisis, with urea sitting around $300 to $350 a ton, the subsidy budget was a manageable 19.5 billion US dollars. But today, under the current supply chain crisis, prices have been pushed above $700 a ton. The cost of that subsidy has effectively doubled. Just to maintain current prices for farmers, the government is staring down a staggering $15 to $20 billion unbudgeted fiscal bomb. And this creates a truly impossible trilemma for Prime Minister Modi's administration. Think about their options. Option 1, they can increase the national deficit by absorbing that $20 billion hit, which is economically precarious. Option 2, they can pass the cost on and raise prices on the farmers. Or option 3, they can simply reduce the quantity of subsidized fertilizer available. When 60% of your country's population depends directly on agriculture, options 2 and 3 are politically explosive. Honestly, there are zero easy macroeconomic exits here. And that brings us to the final part, Section 5, the global food contagion. This right here is the systemic risk climax of our explainer, because what happens in India absolutely will not stay in India. Let's mechanically step through exactly how this domestic agricultural stress test transforms into a global crisis. Step 1, the Hormuz closure stops the imports. Step 2, that creates a massive fertilizer shortage. Step 3, the shortage forces urea plant gas cuts. Step 4 is where it hits the dirt. Reduced fertilizer availability inevitably leads to lower Kharif rice yields. We're talking even a tiny drop of just 5 to 10%. Step 5, a drop in domestic yield triggers overwhelming domestic political pressure, leading to a strict rice export ban, which, by the way, is exactly what India enacted back in 2023 with non-basmati white rice. And finally, Step 6, that export ban triggers a full-blown global food crisis. To truly grasp the scale of that final step, you really just need to look at this one number, 25%. If India restricts rice exports to protect its own population due to these fertilizer constraints, it will instantly remove approximately 25% of all globally traded rice from the international market overnight. No warning, prices will spike violently. Nations that are highly dependent on Indian rice exports, places like Bangladesh, Nepal, and several African countries, will face an immediate, devastating supply crisis. This is, without a doubt, the most consequential gamble in the global food market today. So, we have 1.4 billion people, a finite stockpile, a geopolitical conflict with no end date in sight, and the monsoon, which, as we know, waits for absolutely no one. If the stockpile holds, the crisis is contained. But if it falls short, the global food system faces its most severe shock since 2008. So I'll leave you with this question to ponder. Can India actually get through this Kharif season without a catastrophic fertilizer crisis? And seriously, what happens to the price of food on your table if they can't? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the data.